have a conversation about whether the sharing economy is really the sharing economy.
All right. Sally, thank you very much. Thanks for the very wonderful invitation to be here. Special thanks to Andy and to Frank and Dale and Abstentia. Sally's right. I'm going to talk a bit today about the sharing economy. The general appraisal, just to cut to the chase, that I'm going to provide is fairly critical. And I'm going to try to, in somewhat systematic fashion, try to expose some of the false impressions, some of the myths, some of the sloppy thinking, at least from my perspective, that has emerged over the last really short period of time, last couple of years, about the sharing economy. Before getting into it, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on a public service announcement of sorts. Some of you, or maybe even most of you, may be aware that I'm one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of something called the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative. It goes by the rather inarticulate acronym SCORI. SCORI was established initially about 5 or 6 years ago as or what has sort of evolved into as a sort of quasi-professional association or network of people working in and around issues of sustainable consumption. Maybe it's just one of those ideas that comes along at the right time. The reception of the wider community to SCORI has been, at least from my perspective, really rather extraordinary. The network encompasses about 700 people now, and is in the business of providing an array of what we might think of as membership services to those folks who engage in varying different capacities. SCORI has begun over the last couple of years to sort of spread its wings. In addition to what has evolved into a North American chapter, there's a European sort of sister branch of SCORI that is involved in organizing its own slate of regular activities. There's a workshop taking place in London next week. There's another one taking place in Lausanne in December. Something else taking place next spring in Galway in Ireland. And SCORI is sort of providing, I think, an important service in terms of institutional infrastructure to the field of sustainable consumption research. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that the North American wing is involved in at the moment. We're in the midst, or about 1/3 of the way through, a year-long colloquium series on consumption and social change, where we have purposefully sort of gone outside of the bounds of our sort of own circumscribed sustainable consumption community to really bring in people who are thought leaders on the issue of social change from different disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives. And if you take a look at the SCORI website, we post videos of each of those colloquium events in the days immediately after they happen. Just 2 weeks ago, we had John Sterman, the very eminent system dynamicist from MIT, give an exceptional talk on sustainable consumption from a systems modeling perspective. Juliet Shore will be giving the talk later on in October. Doug Holt, who used to be based in Oxford, comes out with a marketing background, will be coming up later on in November. The end of this colloquium process, we will be convening a workshop in the US, which will be a little bit more inwardly focused on bringing in people from the more immediate sustainable consumption community to try to make sense of where we are intellectually in understanding opportunities for social change around prevailing consumption practices. We are also working quite closely with a group of municipal sustainability planners in North America. At the end of October, we will be holding a really sort of a breakthrough event trying to bring what we know as academics about sustainable consumption to a group of progressive sustainability planners who are interested in trying to figure out strategies for implementing sustainable consumption at the city scale. Finally, and this may be of more direct relevance and interest to some of the folks here, is that you may be aware there's a mega conference, sort of conference of conferences, that has now been announced and scheduled to take place in November of 2015 in Barcelona. That's being organized by Don Housing, the editor of the Journal of Cleaner Production. And this is being conceived of as really a mega event involving a number of different academic disciplines, interdisciplinary associations, networks, sort of all coming together under this umbrella. And SCORI will be a co-partner, planner, participant in putting that together. And then finally, again, also maybe of relevance, some of the folks here, particularly those of you who have an interest or work on issues of social practices, I'm in the process of working with a couple of colleagues on the finalizations of a book, edited book that we call Putting Sustainability into Practice, Applications and Advances in Practice Theories, with a couple of, that's being done with a couple of Canadian colleagues. So SCORI has become really kind of a dynamic node for lots of things going on in and around the field. And if anybody is interested in getting more directly involved or even sort of more passively involved, so the first port of call would be to take a look at the SCORI website, which provides a full menu of information on the kinds of things that we're up to. And I also, sort of in a different capacity, serve as the editor of a sustainability journal called Sustainability Science, Practice and Policy, that was paradoxically perhaps launched initially with funding from the US federal government, and has become an important venue, publication channel for academic work on various facets of sustainability, science, practice, and policy. So put that out to you as well if it's something that is new. So work I'm going to talk about here this afternoon is on the sharing economy, but it's part of a much larger writing project that I am pursuing over the course of the forthcoming year that is interested in looking analytically and critically at opportunities beyond consumerist lifestyles, both from a normative and a non-normative perspective. What are the pathways that we might be able to take advantage of and to exploit for moving beyond a dominant system of social organization predicated on consumerism? And one of those facets that I'm looking at is the focus of the chapter that was distributed and that I'll talk in more detail about in a few minutes, centers on the sharing economy. But that's only one piece of it. I thought it'd be useful to spend a minute or two just kind of giving you a little sense of what the larger architecture is. I'm also interested in what has come to be referred to as the maker movement. This is the kind of elaboration of what 10 years ago was referred to as the DIY movement, but that has become much more of a social movement focused on artisanal crafting, or what from a slightly more technical consumption-oriented perspective we might think of as prosumption, the conflation and combination of production and consumption, a term that was developed originally back in the 1970s by Alvin Toffler. Another chapter of the book is focused on what I've come to refer to as radical relocalization. So this is much more than just community-supported agriculture and local food and farmers markets, but it is initiatives taking place in many places around the world that takes a much more radical interpretation to the whole idea of localizing lifestyles in terms of community energy production, time banks, community currencies, and a more sort of comprehensive package of how we can go about the process of relocalizing our lifestyles in ways that go beyond somewhat more simplistic ideas of localization that tend to take a much more, what I would construe as sort of business boosterism perspective as a way of promoting the financial interests of local businesses. Finally, I'm quite keenly interested from a slightly different perspective. I'm not sure how this is going to fit into the overall book I'm working on at the moment. I'm very interested in Japan. I don't speak Japanese. I probably don't know much more about Japan than the average person. But I have come over the last couple of years to regard Japan as a potential vanguard of macro-scale systemic change. Now typically, particularly if you read the international business press, Japan tends to be portrayed as, and has been for a generation, as the basket case of the global economy. And that's one perspective. But an alternative perspective that Japan is a forerunner, because of some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, of adaptations that have occurred structurally that other countries in the upper income tier of the OECD may be following quite closely behind. And there may be some interesting lessons that we can derive about how you adapt to conditions of slow growth, how you adapt to conditions of extreme demographic aging, how you adapt to conditions of financial and economic deflation. I mean, all these are problems and situations that Japan has been confronted with over the last 2 decades. So, my general perspective is informed by the idea of the fact that we live, and I say it this way, we really do live in a consumer society. And I use that term as a point of analytic departure, not as the sort of pejorative term that it oftentimes gets kicked around as a way for oftentimes sort of ordinary people just to sort of poke fun at themselves, as characterizing themselves and their lifestyles as being emblematic of a consumer society. But I think that there's real value in thinking about the consumer society as a particular historical moment. One that, and I just sort of lift this definition from the dictionary, consumer society is a community in which the buying and selling of mass-produced goods and services is promoted through mass media and is the dominant economic activity. I think that provides a quite useful foundational basis for thinking in historical terms about sort of where we have been, where we are, where we're potentially going in the context of what historians like Ferdinand Braudel have referred to as the longue durée. That if we think in historical terms of the last 300 or 400 years, that there's been a process of societal evolution from a system of social organization premised around agrarianism to a system of social organization predicated on industrialism. And so these dates that I put in here are really just sort of loose markers and more or less refer more to this country, recognizing that other countries have sort of moved through this process at different paces and at different speeds. Finally, to a period, an epochal period of consumerism that came really into full flower after World War II. And this type of analysis, interestingly, maps quite closely to the way in which development theorists have come to think about processes of social development and evolution. In particular, a theory put forward all the way back in the 1960s by Walter Rostow, which continues to implicitly inform much of our thinking about these types of ideas, in which high mass consumption comes to be regarded as the pinnacle stage of societal development. Now, Rostow and many who followed after him have failed to give important and attentive consideration to what happens after the preconditions for high mass consumption begin to deteriorate. That any economic system sits on a set of foundational pillars, and as we know from even a cursory understanding of history, that those pillars go through a process of being built up and gradually go through a process of erosion or deterioration, and that it is an inevitability that what we regard today as a high mass consumption society is going to evolve into something else. In some other work, I've referred to this subsequent developmental stage as the phase of post-consumerism. As time has gone on, I've become a little less comfortable with that particular term. But it's an inevitability that there will be a future beyond high mass consumerism. I mean, to draw on the characterization of Francis Fukuyama from about 25 years ago, that high mass consumption is not the end of history. And I think that interesting question, and perhaps of interest to everyone here, is where we're going. Where we're going to be 20 or 30 years from now, and what is the role of scenario analysis, transition planning, a whole variety of other theoretical perspectives and methodological toolkits can be brought to bear on once we come to the recognition that there is a future beyond high mass consumerism. There's a strong tendency, probably even in this room, to idealize consumer society. It's probably fair to say that all of us here have grown up and have lived our entire lives in a system of social organization in which the imperatives of consumption and consumerism have been paramount. And it is extremely difficult to envision how lives might be reconstituted and reformed at some point in the future in ways that are as radically different as agrarianism is from industrialism, or as industrialism is from consumerism. So the unarticulated claim here is that we are going through a process of transitional change, though it remains quite unclear where that trajectory might be headed. Many of the pillars that served as the foundational supports of consumer society are in a process of erosion. I don't have time today to spend talking about all of these in detail, but we can just sort of quickly enumerate the fact that, I think I've got slides to this effect. Yeah, that the United States and other comparable countries are going through a process of demographic aging that's having profound implications for the consumption practices and consumption packages that people aspire to. And the United States is not even at the more extreme end of this process of demographic aging. We've had in the United States dramatically, a little bit less dramatically here, process that's going on for 3 decades now of wage stagnation, of increases in income accruing almost exclusively to the wealthiest households and wealthiest individuals, and for those in the median range of the distribution, and in particular those at the lower end, there has been no growth in income, and again at the lowest ends it's been a process of income decline in real terms that households have experienced. Increasing income inequality, this is the trend in the United States, has skyrocketed in the last 20 or 30 years. And we're now at the point of reaching levels of income inequality that we haven't seen since the late 1920s. Slowing of economic growth, and again this is where the case of Japan becomes interesting, that the requisite sort of 3.5% annual rates of economic growth seem to have disappeared into the historical record, and that since the 1970s economists and policy planners consider themselves fortunate if we manage to eke out 1.5% or 2%. So there's been a qualitative change in magnitude of the ability of economic growth to be available as a source of solutions. Increasing cost of critical natural resources. There's been a reversal over the last decade. These are data put together by McKinsey, which represent a composite of natural resource prices. And we've also, actually, as I was walking up here, there was Social Democrats, or somebody had a table set out on the street in front of Manchester Metropolitan, trying to generate some political attention around moving away from austerity policies. The general notion of austerity is antithetical to a consumer society, where government has typically and historically played the role of priming the pump to enable people to consume by providing retirement pensions, to shift propensities from savings to consumption. Governments have been engaged in providing the physical infrastructure, whether it's airports or railways or highways, to move people and goods around as a means of facilitating consumptive lifestyles. Governments have been available, especially in the United States, to provide funding for home purchases and to make available the subsidies that enable home purchasing to proceed on the scale that it has historically in the United States. So not only in the US, but I think many other countries around the world, the interest and the capability of governments to continue to play the role that they have as the agents of last resort in facilitating consumptive lifestyles has shifted. In terms of other social trends we see occurring in the US and here as well, powerful processes of re-urbanization occurring, and by contrast, de-suburbanization. The two largest demographic cohorts in the United States these days are the baby boomers and the so-called echo boomers, or millennials. And these are two demographic cohorts that are demonstrating a profound inclination for urbanized lifestyles and are abandoning or not investing themselves in suburbanization and the processes of consumption associated with that. We had a talk a little bit earlier about what's been referred to as peak car, declining automobile utilization. Again, here you see one of the reasons why Japan, again, becomes very interesting, where there's been a significant drop-off. This is a complicated story. It's a complicated story that relates to a role that actually the automobile industry itself has played. As cars have become more technically sophisticated, as it's become impossible for an ordinary person to crawl under under their car and do basic repairs, because you need to hook it up to hook the vehicle up to a computer monitor. The fetishized relationship, particularly between teenage males and their cars, has lost its influence. I spent some time a couple of years ago reading consultancy reports produced for the automobile industry, trying to figure out how you resolve this problem of not just encouraging teenagers to buy cars, but how you induce them to buy into a much more expansive automobile-reliant lifestyle. At the same time, the phones and smartphones and electronic devices that you all have sitting in front of you have, from an environmental or a sustainability perspective, been a wonderful success story, at least in certain circumscribed terms, because you now don't need to drive a 2.5-ton vehicle across town to go visit with your friends. You can communicate with them with a device that sits in the palm of your hand. So those factors and others have contributed to this decline in the automobile, which is essential and important to understanding about the future of consumerism and consumer society, because of the central role the car has historically played as the centerpiece of that kind of lifestyle. And again, we also had a bit of a conversation about this before in the SCI offices about shifting occupational opportunity structures. Difficult challenges that the college graduates have had over the last several years, gaining a foothold in the employment market, the uncertain prospects that they have even once they have a job, is having ramifying influences on consumption. And I think this is really a ripe area, is how we begin to think and link together changes taking place in labor markets with changes taking place in consumption practices. So again, to sort of put some of this into a transitions perspective, what we're looking at, or what I'm primarily interested in, is kind of the level of transition analysis that tends to get taken for granted. The landscape. And most of those of you who work in this area, the dimensions that get venerated, are the interesting dynamics going on, between creative niches and so forth, and the conflicts that develop between incumbent regimes and insurgent niches. I think the prevailing view within transition studies is to kind of take the landscape for granted. It is what it is, and any changes that occur are going to be rather slow and evolutionary. But it's the macro, particularly the macroeconomic structure, that is of primary interest to me, and the way in which that is creating new new opportunities for what goes on beneath it. The way in which the sort of the envelope of consumption possibilities is being reshaped. So I've gotten into the habit lately of trying to motivating these kinds of talks by posing a somewhat provocative question. Can a consumer society persist in the face of a shrinking middle class? I think, at least from my own mode of thinking, is that there's a close correspondence between middle class income earning opportunities and the ability for those lifestyles to reproduce what we think of as mass consumption. And as the size of the American middle class, both in absolute and relative terms, declines in America, we're seeing some very fundamental changes taking place in the organization of consumption. Not surprisingly, the marketers have already figured this out. That Procter & Gamble refers to this process as the onset of an hourglass society. And this diagram is not really fair because it's drawn in equal proportional terms. Really what this is a relatively small number of people up here and a much larger number of people up here. And that what we thought of at one time as the middle class is being squeezed, with some people having the opportunity to sort of move themselves upward, but the vast majority of people being pushed into the lower part of the, lower part of the hourglass. And Procter & Gamble, as well as a number of other consumer products companies and banks and investment firms, have begun to shift, some of their age-old, venerable brands that were, for decades, pitched as products for a middle-class consumer, are moving those products in terms of their marketing and branding activities either up the income scale, or, because it's much easier to push a product down than it is to lift it up, products being moved down into what oftentimes gets referred to as the value end of the market. All right, so within that larger context, let me talk a little bit now here about the sharing economy, of which the last couple of years there has been, especially in urban North America, places like New York, Chicago, Boston, Vancouver, San Francisco, explosive growth in this area. And for those of you who may be sort of coming to this new, this idea of the sharing economy flies under a couple of different names. Some people refer to it as peer-to-peer provisioning. From a sustainable consumption standpoint, this is sort of coming up out of work on product service systems. Collaborative consumption is a term of currency that's taken on a fair amount of relevance. And the essential idea, it goes back at least to a famous book by Jeremy Rifkin from about a dozen years ago called The Age of Access, when it was initially argued that we are moving, and perhaps this is consistent with the idea of post-consumerism, moving from a society predicated on the ownership of goods to a society organized around the idea of access, or what I like to call as usership of goods. And there's an interesting sort of potted history that one can tell about how we have gotten to this point. I'm going to run through it very quickly. Is that we had a financial crisis, 2007, 2008. Large numbers of people were thrown out of work. Entire job classifications were eliminated or squeezed down to a small portion of their prior size. Lots of people had to begin to figure out how they were going to make a living. At the same time, you had the emergence of a new genre of internet activity, what's come to be referred to as Internet 2.0, or even now people talk about Internet 3.0, and the emergence of what's referred to oftentimes as the world of things, or the Internet of Things. That using your smartphone, you're using it not just to send email and Facebook messages back and forth, but you're using your smartphone to interact with real animate objects. You can turn your washing machine on, you can activate your burglar alarm, you can use your smartphone to start your car, and that this has profound consequences, because now, rather than the internet world being exclusively digital and virtual, it is becoming increasingly physical and object-oriented. There was a spate of books, 2009, 2010, some of you may be familiar with these. Several of these books written by sort of crusading author consultants who sort of work in that area where, you need to have a new book out, in order to be able to make the rounds of the chat shows and have newspaper journalists phoning you up and creating activity through social media, and particularly the book What's Mine Is Yours, which actually, I think I saw sitting on a little library shelf over in the SCI office yesterday. Another one called The Mesh gave an excitement and enthusiasm, a whole new vocabulary, a structure to some of this activity as it was first emerging. Then the consultancies began piling in, and you began to have a bit of a mad rush going on. And at the same time, you also, and this has been, journalists, The Economist doing a cover story and a series of articles that were then picked up by global media much more widely about 2 years ago. And we've also seen, and this has been sort of maybe a more American phenomenon, is billions of dollars of venture capital pouring into these so-called sharing economy companies, to the point that today, some of the more notable ones that we'll have an opportunity to talk about, have market capitalizations in the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. That made a relatively small handful of people very, very rich very, very quickly, but it has also contributed to a business model that is based on the idea of capturing venture capital and then scaling up operations as rapidly as possible so investors can get paid off, and then what happens, happens. But as we will talk about, there's a lot of reason to be skeptical, if not downright dubious, about what has come to be characterized as the sharing economy, because as we'll see, there's painfully little sharing going on in the sharing economy. And some of you may be following some of these debates. It's become increasingly common, at least in internet venues, for the term share washing to gain currency. And most of you are familiar with the idea of greenwashing. We're now seeing the sharing economy equivalent, where a growing number of people are beginning to see through the curtain that has been cast around many of these sharing economy activities. It's also important not, I think, to sort of overestimate the novelty of sharing. Economically advanced societies have been involved in sharing for long periods of time. In this country, there's a history of friendly societies and solidarity federations and social fraternal organizations going back to the 19th century that implemented sharing amongst its membership as an important way of providing social welfare at a time when it wasn't being provided on a state basis. And I think it's also important, and some of you who may know Julian Agaman has recently written to great effect on this point, is that there's a tendency to couch sharing in a kind of elitist discourse, when in fact that there have been legions of people from the earliest days of consumer society that by dint of poverty have been forced to maintain sharing as an essential economic survival strategy, and continue to. We should bear that in mind. There's also a lot of activity that goes on and has been going on for some time in the conventional economy that is based on sharing. A couple of historical examples. A horse-drawn trolley during the latter decades of the 19th century was a form of shared conveyance. You shared your seat with someone, and when you got off, it was occupied by somebody else. And almost from the earliest days of the automobile itself, people figured out that there was money to be made and opportunities around the short-term rental, the short-term leasing of cars. The forerunners of Hertz go back to the 1920s. So when we celebrate Zipcar and Car2Go and so forth as being, novel in the sense of putting into practice an interesting and edgy kind of business model, we need to recognize this has been going on for a long time. And that really all Zipcar has figured out what to do is bring the cars in from the airport and put them on city streets and enable people to rent them by the hour or rather than by the day. It's also, I think, useful to recognize that the trading of secondhand clothing, another important dimension of what's come to be regarded as a sharing economy, was hugely common during the 18th and 19th century, and it wasn't until the earliest 20th century, largely on the basis of interventions by the emergent field of public health, or people who were referred to at the time as sanitarians, who came to regard secondhand clothing as carrying disease. That secondhand clothing came to be stigmatized in the way in which most of us have come to understood it. So as the consumer society developed during the 20th century, sharing as an institutionalized practice came to be deeply stigmatized. And we all sort of know this history about the imperatives of increasing material throughput and creating opportunities that favored consumer purchase over short-term rental. So we've had this explosive growth over the last couple of years in sharing, and I put sharing in inverted commas because it's not really sharing, and we need to keep that point alive in our minds. And also, as a slightly derisive point of turn of phrase, for folks looking sort of analytically at the sharing economy, it's also become common to differentiate so-called big sharing from some of the other more solidaristic kinds of sharing, more grassroots-oriented sharing that is going on at a much smaller scale. And so throughout all of this, and again, this is where the sustainability angle comes in, is that sharing has come to be regarded as a constructive and helpful sustainability strategy. That this is something that from a sustainability policy perspective, people feel that they can push. And that the general idea of access over ownership is consistent with sustainability objectives. I'm going to show, I'll move through it rather quickly, is that there's reason to be very skeptical about that. So in this current project, I've been looking at four facets of the sharing economy. Most of you are probably familiar with Airbnb, which is the sort of most celebrated example of the sharing economy. You put your extra room up on the internet, and people from all over the world get in touch with you and announce their intentions that they want to come and stay over at your house for a night or two or three, and in fact pay you for it. There's, again, this is also another aspect that's been very popularly in the news here and elsewhere, is ride sharing. So the likes of Uber and Lyft and Sidecar. There's slight differences in the business models that some of these operate with, but we can sort of set that aside for the time being. Car sharing, so this is Zipcar, Car2Go, and so forth. And then finally, another aspect or another facet of the sharing economy that I've been interested in is the short-term rental or sharing of clothing. So anybody take advantage of any of Rent the Runway is a famous one, Poshmark is another. There's the universe of clothes sharing websites is virtually infinite these days. And again, they have slightly different business models. Some of them are predicated on matching your wardrobe with somebody else. So serving as kind of a brokering role between somebody who owns an article of clothing and somebody who is interested in wearing that article. Others operate that they have warehouses of inventory, and you go to their website and you select what you want, and you can rent it for a week rather than buying it outright. I don't mean to belabor the point here, but I think it's also important to recognize that there's really a tremendous amount of conceptual confusion around what we understand as sharing. So when you stay at a hotel or a motel, you are participating in the sharing economy because in the morning you go away and somebody else comes in and takes over the bed tonight that you slept in last night. Which seems like sharing to me. You're renting the bed for a short-term period of time and then passing it along down to somebody else. A public swimming pool is also a form of sharing, and as we'll see, the public provision of goods tends to operate implicitly on the basis of sharing. So when you go to a public swimming pool, you're sharing that facility with any number of other people who may be there with you, and then when you leave, somebody else comes in an hour later and shares the resource. Take a flight. You don't buy the plane outright, you rent the seat for 2 or 3 or 6 or 10 hours, however long the flight is going to be, and they refuel the plane, turn it around, somebody else sits on that seat 20 minutes later. Commercial laundromat. Again, you put your clothes in the coin-operated machine, goes through the wash cycle, spin cycle, you put it in a dryer, you take your clothes away, somebody else comes in, uses the same machine after you. Seems like sharing to me. And then, interestingly, some of you may be familiar with the sociologist Harvey Mollich has a recent book out that looks at the politics of sharing public toilets, which makes for fascinating reading, bringing to the surface some of the more sort of humble yet indispensable ways in which we share facilities in the real sense. There's also been a lot of sort of muddy, mucky thinking going on around some of the activities that are seemingly analogous to sharing. So that entails borrowing, bartering, swapping, donating. All of these activities, rather unhelpfully, have been packed in under this umbrella of the sharing economy. So what I'm going to do, again, very quickly here, is sort of move through an analysis that's based on the 3 pillars of sustainability, looking at the sharing economy from its social dimensions, its environmental dimensions, and finally its economic dimensions. And in doing so, I find it useful, or have found it useful, to operationalize this 2-dimensional figure, which on the horizontal axis, is interested in the type of ownership, and on the vertical axis, the reasons for owning something. And that our ownership type can range from being a good that we own on an exclusively individualized basis to a good that's owned collectively or on a conjoint basis. And sometimes conjoint ownership isn't always so obvious because it may be through a government agency that we own something on a collective basis. Ownership motivation ranges from the pecuniary, so from a financial income earning perspective, to a non-pecuniary motivation that could be mediated by a whole variety of non-monetized, non-economized types of motivations. So just for clarity, it's useful to recognize that on the leftward side of this diagram, these are goods that are owned on a personal basis, and on the rightward side, goods that are owned on a collective basis. And then similarly on the top are the vertical dimensions of the figure, goods that are owned for commercial purposes and goods that are owned for non-commercial purposes. So the first category is fairly obvious, and I actually dispense with it quite quickly. The combination of an individual good that's owned for a non-pecuniary purpose, you can think is almost limitless. But these are sort of goods that we own individually, and that we use on an individual basis. So most of your toaster, your blender, your TV set, I mean, these are all goods that are that fall into this category. You individually own them, and that your range of interests and motivations for owning them are not exclusively reliant on using those goods to earn an income. Becoming more interesting is the category that I refer to as communitarian provisioning. So these are sort of the old-style car-sharing schemes where a group of neighbors gets together and buys a car or a couple of cars and then figures out a way of sharing them amongst everyone on a more or less equitable basis. And there are a range of, I'm not so much interested in talking about them today, but there is a dimension of the sharing economy that is premised around communitarian sharing. One of the more famous examples is BlaBlaCar. Anybody familiar with BlaBlaCar, which started in France a couple of years ago? Has a much higher profile on the continent, but the idea is if you're traveling from Paris to Berlin, you can use the BlaBlaCar website to find a passenger who wants to travel that route with you, but the price is fixed at a level that only enables you as the driver to recover your actual expenses. So, you're not going into the taxi cab business by ferrying people from one city to another. You're simply finding a companion to share the ride, the journey, the time, and the cost with you. And it's been, and then the proprietors of BlaBlaCar take a small commission to cover the costs of their involvement in the transaction. So I would put that, it's not about money making in the narrow sense. And the name BlaBlaCar obviously sort of comes from the idea that people will chit-chat sitting next to each other in the car. And if you don't want to chit-chat, when you sign up on the website, you can actually select a tick box that says, no, I don't want to talk. The third category, again combining ownership, collective ownership with pecuniary intention, is serialized rental. So this is the hotel model or the car rental model, where a product is being rented out on a repeated and sequential basis. And finally, the fourth quadrant here is the combination of individual goods being used for pecuniary purposes, and this is what I call brokered freelancing. And what we will find is that most of what is being characterized as activity consistent with this idea of the sharing economy is located here.
Maurie, can I suggest we just do another maybe 5 minutes
Yep.
so that we've got time for discussion?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant.
So, just to sort of apply this to a sort of a mobility context, The car you own that sits in your drive or your garage is in this category. The old-fashioned car-sharing club or ordinary forms of public transportation fit into the second quadrant of communitarian sharing. Short-term rental, this is Zipcar, Hertz, Avis, Holiday Inn, Hilton fall into this category, and anybody's become a customer of Uber or Lyft or one of these other car-sharing services, those are located here. Let me just sort of try to characterize for you from a social sustainability standpoint what is going on in this ostensible sharing economy. First off is that the folks who are driving the cars and serving you your breakfast and changing the sheets in the sharing economy are all independent contractors. They're not employees, they don't receive any employment benefits, no employment protections. If there's a drop-off in tourism or nobody wants to take a ride in an Uber or a Lyft car, they're the ones who shoulder the burdens of that fluctuation. Proponents of the sharing economy talk about it as providing lots of great opportunity, flexibility, great for stay-at-home moms, great for people who are sort of in transitional phases of more formal employment, people who like the idea of freelancing work. But the dilemma here is that they need to bring to the table their own assets. They need to have their own house, their own flat, their own car in order to be an active service provider in the sharing economy, which creates all sorts of problems that we can perhaps talk about. And when you're working as a freelancer and trying to earn a livelihood from it, you need to be perpetually on. Some critics have referred to the sharing economy as the gig economy, because you're continually in search of where your next gig is going to come from. Let me say a couple of things quickly about the environmental dimensions of the sharing economy, because I think this, for most people, is where sort of the sustainability rubber meets the sharing road. Proponents of the sharing economy contend that there is widespread inefficiency and what is referred to by Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar and others, as slack capacity in the consumer economy. So all those cars parked out in the car park, empty bedrooms that exist in someone's home because a child is left home or was extra space that they bought that they never needed in the first place, all the clothes you have hanging in your wardrobe that you wear infrequently, all of this from an efficiency standpoint represents slack capacity that could be put to better purpose than it currently is. And so this idea of moving efficiency thinking from the production sphere, which is of long-standing vintage going back to the latter decades of the 19th century, is being drawn into the consumption sphere. And so suboptimally utilized consumer resources are characterized as waste. So goods that can be put to productive purpose, instead of leaving your car out in the car park for half a day while you yourself are at work, your car can be put to work by being hired by somebody else. Sharing proponents fall into the same trap of many other advocates of efficiency-led strategies, is that they fail to acknowledge that more efficient use lowers costs and increases aggregate consumption, though it's something that those of us in the sustainable consumption community, one way or another, have known for 150 years. Let me just make another couple of points on this, and then we'll bring things a little bit prematurely to a close. Sharing economy companies, at least the most prominent among them, have come to recognize that the best way to sell their services is the same way that everybody else sells their services, by trying to explain to people by how much money you're saving by utilizing their service. So Airbnb saves you money. Zipcar saves you money. A website called Trend Trunk saves you money. And all of this saving money, as most of us are aware, leads to indirect rebound effects. This is an advertisement, somewhat peripherally, comes from an advertisement program of the U.S. Department of Energy, encouraging people to save energy so that they can then go on vacation. I'll make this the last slide, and then we'll sort of open things up for discussion. Is that among the proponents, primary proponents of the sharing economy, there's no evidence, no indication whatsoever of what we would think of or regard as a sustainability or a sufficiency constraint. There's no appreciation for planetary boundaries, and that in many respects, and this comes from a sharing economy website, sharing has become the new shopping. And then one last thought I'll leave you with, and then from a marketing and product chain management perspective, what we see going on here is the reinvention of really an old familiar practice, particularly a practice that has been implemented for decades by the cigarette manufacturers, by the big consumer products companies, when they've set up shop in developing countries. They realized that early on that they couldn't sell their product in the same volumes in a developing country context that they did in a developed country context. That they had to break it down into smaller packets. Individual cigarettes, individual wash packages of laundry detergent, in order to bring the product within the price range and the affordability of its prospective consumers. And what's going on, I would argue, with around the sharing economy is products are being broken down into smaller units. So rather than buying the car, you're buying the individual ride. Rather than buying the dress, you're buying the wearership or the usership of the dress for a discrete period of time. And I think there are strong indications to suggest that rather than stemming consumption, that the reduction in the affordability of the cost and the increasing affordability in many product categories is creating circumstances where the sharing economy will ultimately lead to a hyper form of consumption rather than a sustainable form of consumption. So I'll stop there, and in the remaining time we have, try to respond to any questions that anybody could have. Thanks for your attention.
Very much. That was really interesting. Does anyone want to kind of start the discussion?